Hello and welcome to another Green Sofa Dialogue. I'm so happy today to be joined by two experts in their fields. Carole Mathieu, Head of EU Policies at the Centre for Energy and Climate at the French Institute of International Relations, and Dana Perkins, Head of EMEA at BNEF. Carole Mathieu, Dana Perkins, hello, thank you so much for joining me today.
Wonderful to be here.
Thank you for having me.
I think we should go ahead and get started right away. What does the energy system maybe look like in 2050? And the second part of that question is, how do we have to design the transformation starting now so that we get there by 2050? Carole, maybe you'd like to start.
Yeah. So definitely, I think there are many scenarios on the table, but I think we can say that today we have a robust scientific consensus saying it is feasible, and I think that's an important point. There are many different pathways that you can find, reaching climate neutrality, having climate neutral Europe by 2050 or earlier, but we have to keep in mind that it's technically feasible because we have robust scenarios coming up, and they are all pointing to the same conclusions. But then, of course, there's a wide area of options. So if you look at them collectively, all the information we have on the table, I think one thing is sure, it's that we will have to reduce demand as much as possible. And it's a key parameter, I think, in all climate neutral pathways. So it means we will have for sure to double our efforts on energy efficiency. It means, of course, making a step change in renovation rates. And today, we have the green recovery plans, we have sky high energy prices. So there is definitely a one-time opportunity that we have to grasp. But then energy efficiency is one side of the story, and the other side deals with changing our consumption patterns and our lifestyles. And there, I think it's fair to say that it's not just about individual choices, but it's also about collective choices in the way we organize our societies, in the way we work, in the way we do urban planning. So there's a lot of democratic debate to be had on these aspects. So clearly reducing demand will be number one priority. The energy system of the future will be much more efficient. And I think the other second priority is to electrify end uses as much as possible in the transport sector, in the industry, in heating. It's a sensible way forward because 100% decarbonized electricity system is a workable scenario. So that's one thing that we know. And the next priority is to make these scenarios happen. So it's about sequencing, having a decarbonized electricity system, and then electrify as much as possible. And once this is said, I think you will still have a need for synthetic fuels in hard-to-abate sectors. We have to mention heavy transportation, aviation, some industrial processes where, in the end, electricity may not be the right answer. So again, it means that you need to get prepared for that and define an enabling framework for these solutions to be available when you need them. So yeah, in a word, it's a much more efficient, a much more electrified system with some extent a need for synthetic fuels.
So Carole, I love that you brought up electrification because that would actually be something that we in BNEF do think is a really critical thing for us to be focused on, because that it essentially enables us to use the existing technologies right now, because you also brought up some of the hard to abate sectors. And while we're saying, oh, well, it's potentially feasible for us to reach net zero, this idea of an orderly transition that we're going to ultimately need to happen between now and 2050 and what actually needs to be installed. There are questions out there regarding, I think, some of the technology for the hard to abate space. So, I mean, from our standpoint, I'm not sure if you think about this way, because you were talking a lot about the demand side, but from a supply side, I very much like to think about the energy transition. I think I mentioned just at the beginning in two phases. So I like to think about it, now to 2030, and everything that we're going to need to do, which essentially is the massive deployment of clean energy, which is largely solar and wind, and we do need to think about, you brought up fuels, we do need to think about, green fuels. But that massive deployment in this first phase, so that we have the time, after placing some very strategic R&D bets on technology for the hard to abate sectors, to hopefully reap the benefits of them in that second half. It's not actually a half, but that second phase, so that we actually can get there. And I think this provocative idea of before 2050 really, in my mind, comes down to how much progress we make on the hard to abate sectors in terms of technology advancements and pricing. So, we're in the process of doing an annual exercise where we look at net zero out to 2050, there you go, for Europe, and that comes out at the end of the month. And one of the things that we're actually finding is that due to the EU ETS and carbon trading and the compliance market here, it is possible that hydrogen will be cost competitive by 2030. So it's seeing that and seeing maybe that 1, 2, even 3 years ago, we had thought hydrogen was going to be a much further out technology to implement and then may actually be within grasp, I think is the part for me, when I think about, could we do it sooner? That's the question in my mind, is how far does that one little linchpin, which actually is very huge, how does it help us get to the hard to abate spaces?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on the fact that we have a critical decade, and what we will do by 2030 will define whether we will be able to reach climate neutrality much before 2050. I think there's a lot of happening in many areas, and I think we've reached a point where it's about defining the right mix of technologies, but we have the certainty that there will be enough in the sense, of course, we have to push for innovation, and we have we need these solutions to become more cost effective. But the key point is really to make the right choices at the right time for the solutions to be available and cost competitive. So there's a clear point, I think, in debating all the possible scenarios, defining the share for each resource type, and then defining the right regulatory and market frameworks, because this is what you will need to make the business case for the different solutions and to trigger the investments. So I think it's less of a technical debate and more a debate around our policy choices and the regulatory frameworks that we define. So we should not neglect the political side, I think, of the discussion when we discuss feasibility.
Yeah, the political and social will to actually see these things happen, because I think, if we're looking at just Europe specifically, so our green scenario, so our scenario that relies more heavily on green rather than, nuclear or natural gas as much, we would see 1 terawatt each of wind and solar, roughly speaking, out to 2050. I mean, that is absolutely huge. Just the political will, just the number of people that people will need to hire within governments from a permitting standpoint. I mean, not even to consider what needs to take place in terms of the actual rollout and the supply chain constraints that we currently have in getting this stuff deployed. Every little piece needs to be scaled up in order to make this happen, I think. And, from a warming standpoint, so if we look at economics, so we do this exercise every year called the New Energy Outlook, and it actually looks at the global energy transition and what would actually happen if you looked at economics and you kind of removed the policy element from it. And on a global basis, we're saying the economic transition scenario, we just rely on technologies and the fact that we know in most countries in Europe and globally, renewable energy is the cheapest option. That gets us to a 1.3 degree world by the turn of the century. So for when we looked at, well, what if we actually wanted this to be true? What would need to happen if this were to be true that we would get to net zero by 2050? We came up with 3 possible scenarios, all which relied on, hydrogen to some degree and biofuels and various mixes in there. And each of the 3 scenarios, we actually saw feasibility we landed on 1.75 rather than 1.5 as kind of that benchmark warming, just because the amount that we'd actually need to do right now is just so vast. And I don't know if this is something that you're looking into, but I think we're very curious to see what happens also on the supply chain side. There's not even just the political will, like what is actually feasible to physically build and get in place, given everything that's happening right now. I heard from someone who's on the wind side of things, from a wind development standpoint. They've had their contracts for wind turbines pushed back because of natural gas prices and gas rationing in China. And that's for projects here in Europe. So, we're definitely at we're at an inflection point that it looks like it's not going to improve in the very near term, but we think will improve in the longer term. And I think that's the tricky part because, we're saying this decade. And when I was ringing the New Year bell for 2022, I'm going, oh gosh, that means 8 years now left in this decade, which I'm so fixated on.
Absolutely. I think there's a question of industrial capacity. And it's also probably why, leaving aside the economics and the theoretical debates, you will see different choices in different countries, even in Europe, because each country will analyze its resource potential, but also its industrial capacities and the feasibility in terms of deploying the solutions on time. So it means that perhaps there's no, optimal mix of solutions for every country, but you will see different choices taking into account the industrial landscape, perhaps the cultural preferences for each solution or for one solution or another. And so it will not just be a debate about the economics. Of course, you will see more wind and more solar everywhere if it's possible. But then, I think you can expect some diversity in Europe relating to 100% decarbonized mix. And I think our goal should be to be supportive of one another and united in this diversity. But a lot will depend on the choices we make and on the support from society and from the industrial sectors themselves.
Carole, you talked a little bit about this optimal path to 100% renewables. Do you have ideas, maybe where you are in Paris? Is there a way that this could look for Paris, this optimal path to get to 100% renewables?
I think it's an open debate, and we learn every day. And I think no one has a definite answer to that question. Of course, we have to assess our renewable potential, and for example, within Europe, all countries neighboring the North Sea, they have a great potential for offshore wind. And I think all countries are going to massively bet on offshore wind in the region. Now, if you take other countries, perhaps they have a less favorable potential for fixed offshore wind. So, of course, if there's a breakthrough in floating wind technology, it could totally change the perspective. But I think it's fair to say that you will not see the same type of developments relating to offshore wind in all countries. Now, some countries have a lot of hydro, perhaps limited potential to develop more hydro, but still it will be an important resource for them to define their electricity portfolio. And then I think you will have, I don't know if we should call them cultural differences or national preferences, but our national debates are certainly different, and all decarbonized options, they have their downsides relating to land use, to local acceptance issues, to the material footprint, potential dependence on external sources. So I think all these arguments will play a role in the debate. And of course, as a French citizen, I have to say that nuclear is an option for some countries. So I think you cannot exclude that in some member states, the conclusion will be that it's more cost effective to have a certain share of nuclear in the mix, in the electricity mix. But I think a common point for all member states is a massive development of renewables. So even in a country like mine, where there's a discussion about renewing the nuclear fleet, all the studies, the technical studies that have been done by our TSOs and other players, they are all saying that we need a massive deployment of renewables, and actually we are quite late. If you take the French example, we have no offshore wind park operational, and it's definitely a pity, and it's painful for our electricity system. So we need a change on these aspects. And then about the right mix, I think, to me, the important point is that we have a democratic debates, and we hear of all the opportunities, of the complementarities, of the downsides, and everyone is able to measure the implications. And if we have this sound debate, then we can define a strategy, and then we will be able to stick to it. Because as we said, I think there's a big question mark around implementation. So it's not just about, discussing the optimal mix. It's also about a sustained commitment from the state, but also from society behind these strategies. And I think it's what we need to do in the coming years.
I mean, I would say that we at BNEF are not in the business of figuring out the optimal side. We tend to do a lot of scenarios just to push the limits to see what, just to think about things a little bit differently, because gosh, who knows? I mean, you brought up the diversity of what is actually going to be in the grid, and that's just the reality. But it is going to be incredibly diverse, and there's a number of different ways to get there. I think the thing that isn't really popular that we are all kind of thinking about right now actually has to do with the important part around flexibility and what we build in order to enable all of the renewables to actually operate in some sort of economically feasible way without massive, oversupply at certain points. And I know it's not popular to be talking about or thinking about natural gas at the moment, given that the prices are so volatile, in many cases high, and are really causing, I'm here in the UK today, and in the UK, we've seen utilities close, and we've seen it's a really volatile space, and you're seeing it across the market. You're seeing prices go up, and that's hitting individuals in a way that is creating some real, I think, strife for the end consumer and the regular person. So driving that commitment from the regular person is going to be difficult. I think will probably be increasingly difficult. Now, on the flip side of that, those on the renewable side would say, well, the good way to control pricing is just to build more renewables, because then you become a domestic energy producer. But we still have to recognize that there's always going to be some delta there that we're going to need to deal with, either on the seasonal flexibility, I think, is the harder part to answer than the daily flexibility. And within that, I think maybe we could see nuclear make a comeback in some ways. I mean, small nuclear is increasingly talked about. I didn't think I would see coal being used as a form of flexible capacity, but it is now. Batteries invariably, but they have their limitations. And then for us to think about natural gas differently. So we think about natural gas, and I think this is the real tricky part, is right now, we're going to need to see some built in this side of 2030 discussion. So in order to maintain, safety margins and security of supply, our most recent forecast showed that Europe would need to build another 92 gigawatts of new gas by 2030. But then keeping in mind that those can really run for 40 years, and at minimum, those building them want them to run for at least 25 years. But we want to see them phased out by 2030. If you're really looking at a net zero scenario, how do we really think about the role that flexibility has to play in all of this in terms of on the supply side? And I think that that's going to be a big trick, actually, for governments to think about. And one thing that occurred to me recently, which I think I'd like to bring up, is that we're looking for all of these economic mechanisms to exist, but what if the natural gas side of things from a government standpoint was something that we saw as roads? Roads are, in my opinion, my tax dollars, that it's a direct subsidy to vehicles, whether they're logistics or transportation for individuals to get around. I mean, essentially, there is this thing that we are going to need, at least in the near term, that has very little appetite beyond 2050. And how are we going to make that happen? Because it's how everything works together that gets us to the solution. So I'm not sure if you have an opinion on that, but so much time is spent thinking about natural gas at the moment that And just so, I mean, also just to caveat in there, we do think that prices will settle down, not this year, not necessarily next year, but beyond that. So our long-term scenarios, our 2050 outward-looking scenarios, don't show this is massively changing. However, I mean, we'll see.
I think we agree with you that of course you can say that the long-term argument is to develop renewable production, so you have a local source of production and you don't need unreliable gas anymore. But everyone can agree on the long-term picture, but I think we should not forget about what's in front of us for the coming decade. So we tend to share the same opinion and think that we have to accept our dependency on gas as a fact for perhaps the coming decade, but for the sake of our climate neutrality targets, we should plan for the next step. So when you're saying that the European system will need a lot of additional gas capacities in the near medium term, that's true. But then the second step should be to think of how we decommission these plants, or how we turn them to different plants working with decarbonized fuels. I think we need to start, I mean, we cannot build new gas units without thinking of the second step. And I think that's the challenge that we face as Europeans, except that for the short term, medium term, we need to live with gas and find solutions for reliable supplies. But as of today, plan the next steps and have this discussion about flexibility resources. Which ones do you want? To what extent? And what do you need for them to actually be developed at scale? And I hope that we'll be able to have this discussion at the European level, because it would be much more effective. And I think Germany is taking the lead. We are seeing the new targets, and perhaps they will be the ones facing these issues the first. So they are going to open this debate. It's key for the national targets, but if we can have a European view on these issues, it would be for the benefit of all. And if we can integrate the potential and the benefits from cross-border interconnectors, if we can have a broader discussion on our flexibility needs by 2030, by 2040, beyond. And of course, keep this principle of technological neutrality, but still work on the enabling frameworks so that we end up with the right solutions. I think it's probably the key parameter to reach our targets before 2050. It's to be able to have an open discussion at the European level. Let's hope for it. And that's why I think all member states will have to be very open and learn from one another, because a lot is going on, and the debates are evolving very rapidly, I think.
I do love also that you brought up learn from one another, because I think the way I like to think of Europe is an incubator for the rest of the world when it comes to the energy transition. And I know that we're thinking about how to get to 2050, but I'm thinking, oh gosh, if beating 2050 sort of here doesn't matter if the technology and the economics and the development on the hydrogen and the CCS side, or even just on the market design side, actually has these ripple effects to other parts of the world that are waiting for the economics to play out. I mean, that's the real role that I think the European Union can play in terms of climate.
And from this perspective, it would make sense to, as Europeans, to achieve climate neutrality before 2050, just to leave room for other regions of the world to, meet their energy needs, define a new development model, and using as much of the carbon budget as they need.
I've been having a great time listening to both of you engage in such an incredible dialogue with one another, and I want to thank you both very much for your thoughts so far. Before we wrap things up, I want to ask you though for your final thoughts. I've got a couple more questions that I've written down, but I think we've covered so much today, or rather you've covered so much today. we've been looking sort of ahead into the future the whole time that we've been talking. And now I want you to do that again, but maybe from a more personal perspective. And ask you, okay, if you have one wish for something that would maybe go faster than it is, or one specific thing that you really want to maybe push the envelope a bit with, what would that be? Dana Perkins?
Oh gosh, I think my pet thing is heat. And specifically residential heat, I find really interesting because there's a lot of analysis that has been done around this idea of heat pumps and how they're going to, or electrifying heat. You see certain countries like the Netherlands kind of taking the lead on this, and the UK talking about having targets to actually roll out domestic gas boilers. And I know this is just one piece of the puzzle, but it really, I personally have tried to put a heat pump in my home and found it extraordinarily difficult in terms of finding someone to do it and working with the renewable heat incentive and all of the different aspects that actually go into rolling this out to the end consumer. And then invariably what you end up hearing, whether it is true or not, you end up hearing people talk about, oh, well, it's buggy, or I can't find someone to repair it because the kit is so complicated. So there's something there where I feel like we are just on the edge of a massive breakthrough in phasing out natural gas and relying on the electrification of heat that is the thing that I would just love to see just drop over the line. And I think that Europe, we have the political will in order to do it, but we don't have the new build. We have this existing infrastructure. I mean, I'm sitting in a beautiful home that has been built before 1900. So invariably, there is a limit on the things that I can do in my flat to actually make my life more energy efficient. And that's just on the micro individual scale. So, but you asked me to be selfish and be personal and think about, my experience, but that on, on a much bigger scale in terms of office buildings, urban planning, and how we actually go about this. I think that heat within the hard to abate space feels like it's close. So it makes me want to wish that it gets right there.
Yeah, me too. Actually, that's one of my favorites. Carole, Mathieu, what about you?
I tend to agree that we have to focus on energy demand in buildings, and perhaps it's difficult to make it a political priority. It's perhaps less of a sexy debate compared to the ones on hydrogen or other supply side solutions. But there's a lot here. The energy demand from buildings are about 40% of total energy demand in Europe. And if you look at the past years, we are seeing very, very little, very slow progress on these aspects. And perhaps you know that the European Commission wanted to launch this renovation wave, and I think it's a very ambitious and very needed project, but of course it cannot happen from Brussels. You have to involve the national authorities, you have to involve the local authorities, the different sectors, because there are questions around skills and the availability of the workforce. So it's a massive challenge, but I think it's worth it. And we are talking a lot about the green recovery. At the moment, there's a lot of public money available, and it's definitely, I think, an opportunity. And I would hope that in the next years, as Europeans, we would be able to say that we have been up to this challenge and really improved the energy performance of our existing buildings, because as Europeans, we have a lot of very old buildings, and we have to accept it as a fact and really improve their performance. So I would hope that these aspects take perhaps more importance in the public debate compared to supply side solutions. And on a personal note, I would hope for very inclusive and democratic debates around the energy transitions, because somehow a majority, I think, of Europeans is in favor of protecting the climate, of reaching climate neutrality, but it's difficult for everyone to measure the implications. And I think there's a lot to do in this area to have a more informed debate let everyone anticipate the changes at an individual and at a collective level, because if we can do that, then we will have a more, I think, sustained support for this massive transition, and this is actually what we need to reach our targets, because we are talking about 2050 and a lot can happen on all fronts. So we need a very large and sustained, I think, mobilization from all the actors.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of my guests, Carole, Mathieu, and Dana Perkins, for joining me for this Green SOFA Dialogue. Here's a special shout out to JB. We hope to see you soon. Thank you both.